right. Good morning. Welcome, Dr. Price. Thank you for joining me on Pulling the Threads podcast again this time. How you doing this morning?
It's great fun. Thanks.
So, um, yeah, today I wanted to, like last time we kind of talked about Christ mythology and historical versus the mythicist view. Today I kind of wanted to ask you questions about the origins of Christianity. Who is Paul? You wrote a book on the colossal apostle. Gabriel Boccaccini has wrote works that he refers to Paul as kind of in the vein of Enochian Judaism, a branch of Hellenistic Judaism, kind of based within the Enochian literature. Can you give me some background on, I guess, like who you see Paul as and kind of where he falls within, I guess, Gabriel Boccaccini's view of like Enochian Judaism and where his writings come out of?
Well, the Enochian thing is really interesting. Like the Dead Sea Scrolls seem to participate in that thought world, and as does the Gospel of John. But it's a little tougher to see the Paul of the epistles as fitting as easily into that. He doesn't speak of the Son of Man. He doesn't use the same sort of metaphors, the symbols of the animals standing for the different leaders of Israel and other nations. He's somewhat interested in angels, and usually they're malevolent ones. And then we know that the Dead Sea Scrolls people and the people that treasured the various books of Enoch, of which there were many. I mean, our first Enoch is a Pentateuch, actually, of 5 originally different writings. And then there is the Slavonic Enoch, which may have been written slightly later, which I think is more of a unitary work. And then there is the couple of centuries later, Third Enoch or Hebrew Enoch. And then we're told there were several other ones, that some more are mentioned in the testaments of the 12 patriarchs and so on. And from what I remember, angels there are in that whole tradition are good, and the armies of God, which of course you would expect from the Yahweh Sabaoth, the Lord of hosts. But in the Pauline epistles, it sounds more Gnostic to me, in that the angels mentioned are in a group of the principalities, powers, dominions, thrones, and all this, which Paul speaks of, like in Romans, is those entities which would separate us from God, but for Christ managing to break through and be our advocate. He speaks of lustful angels in 1 Corinthians, that's his final big reason Corinthian women should go veiled, because otherwise they may be attracting the frisky attentions of angels, just like Eve did when she was unveiled completely in the garden. And yet, of course, Enoch knows of the Watchers as fallen angels, so it's not like that's totally alien, but they seem to be more active in Paul, like still up to their old mischief. But these might be judged in a larger framework as variations of a theme, and just different emphases according to what each seer or thinker visualizes as important. Now, I kind of go through a back door into seeing a real connection between Paul and this kind of sectarian Judaism. When I say, as I argue in The Amazing Colossal Apostle, that Paul was another name for the guy we know as Simon Magus, things said about Simon and his relation to the sect of John the Baptist, that he was the the would-be, I should say, he was slated to be the successor of John, but was away in Egypt when John died, and for the lack of him, they demoted number 2 in line, Dositheus the Samaritan, to be the head of the sect. When when Simon returned, he said, where's John? Oh, sorry, he passed away, but Dositheus is in charge. And he says, oh, he is, huh? And he managed to be a good sport about it for a while, but came to be disillusioned with Dositheus and challenged him to a kind of a miracle contest. Who could be like docetic and polymorphous and kind of transcend the flesh. And in a kind of a duel with Dositheus yielded and said, all right, I got to admit it, you're the standing one, which is sort of a Gnostic synonym for the great power of God. And however, he must have split with them eventually, and it really looks that way if you go with Robert Eisenman, as I do, and think that the sect of John described in the Pseudo-Clementines was the same as the Qumran community, and by extension, the same as the Jerusalem congregation. Now, we hear that in the Dead Sea Scrolls, though, of course, they're written in cipher language, so you never really can be sure who they're talking about. But I find Eisenman very plausible that the individual called the spouter of lies or the mocker was kicked out of the community because he was trying to make things easy for the simple ones of Ephraim, who seemed to be Gentiles, by saying, oh, you can join the covenant too, and you don't have to worry about all those strict things that the Qumran monks do. To the Qumran elders, of which there were 12, interestingly, they said, no, you're just deluding these people. You're selling smooth things. It's cheap grace, as Bonhoeffer would have called it. And you're building a city on blood, a phrase that occurs in the scrolls. So he left or was kicked out. It said he was, I think, expelled from the covenant for having denied the covenant itself. And so to me, this sounds a lot like the Pseudo-Clementine story of Simon Magus and the sect of John. And yet there is also this interesting thing in Galatians, which seems to remember that Paul managed to reconcile with the Jerusalem pillars, the big three, whom I identify with the three men of the inner circle in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And they said, look, they needed the money. They were a small group. They had a kind of socialist communitarianism that'll bankrupt any group that tries it. And so they were the poor, the Ebionites also. And Paul, apparently, or Simon, was having great success among the Gentiles, partly by altering the nature of the preaching to something that they could make more sense of, like Jesus as a mystery religion savior. This gets really messy, but Irenaeus tells us that Simon claimed to have appeared as Jesus earlier and to have apparently suffered on the cross, though in fact he hadn't, and that he had been active in the Old Testament period as the Father. When he was Jesus, he was the Son, and now he's the Spirit. Well, my guess is that the Qumran/Jerusalem church had no Jesus figure originally, though they did have a leader. So they sort of had a hole to fill there, and that to have this rapprochement with Simon, he said, all right, let's get back together, but I'm not going to change my gospel, but how about you give me your blessing to go preach it to the Gentiles, whom you're not preaching to anyway? Think of Matthew 10. Their great commission was, don't go to the Gentiles or the Samaritans, only the lost sheep of Israel. Well, okay. Well, as in Galatians said, they decided Peter would go to the circumcised, me to the uncircumcised. But this didn't, and part of his price was you have to accept me as the Messiah, at least in the first go-round. And that's kind of why the 12, whose names, at least the 3, their titles in the Gospels implied they had cosmic significance. Peter, the rock, presumably the cosmic navel stone of the temple that kept the floodwaters in check. James and John, the Boanerges, who I think has to do with Boaz and Jachin, the 2 great pillars, which stand for the pillars that hold up the vault of the heavens. And so they were cosmic entities. But they get shoved aside in the Gospels. And why is that? Well, because when the Gospels were written, they gave pride of place to Simon's Jesus and made his lieutenants the 12 disciples, who had been really the 12 councilmen of Qumran, and the inner circle became the pillars. They were still sort of important, but they suffer in comparison with Jesus. So it seems to me that, and then the whole thing fell apart because of what we also read in Galatians, that the Jerusalem church must have begun to think, wait a minute, maybe we can eliminate the middleman. How about if we go around to these churches Paul founded, or Simon, take your pick, and tell them, you're off to a good start, brethren, but I'm afraid Paul only taught you the beginning of it. If you want to really go the whole way, of course, you've got to be circumcised and keep the Torah. And some of them said, well, that's reasonable. If Jesus was Jewish, it would make sense. We follow the Jewish law. And so Paul, they do this after Paul is left, and he finds out about it and said, what is going on here? You guys are knifing me in the back. And that's certainly the way he seems to put it in Galatians. I thought we had a deal. What is this? In fact, if you follow this route, you're cutting yourself off from Christ. You're saying he died for nothing. If nothing has changed. And so the temporary reconciliation came apart, and this is very complicated, and I realize the more links you have in a chain of hypotheses, the less probable it becomes. And so it's a reconstruction. It's a possible way of looking at it. You can never be sure that this is true. So I'm not getting on my high horse about it, my hobby horse, and say, oh yeah, we know this is true, and if you don't think so, you're no scholar. Baloney. I admit, but this does seem to me to be a compelling way of putting together a lot of bits and pieces that otherwise just all seem very strange and hard to put into the conventional orthodox view of Christian origins. And ultimately, to skip ahead, it seems to me that Christianity, as it emerged as Catholicism, was ultimately the result of 3 sort of later developments, 3 forms of Christianity, pre-Christianity. The sacramental system seems to me to have come directly from the mystery religions, because from what we hear about early Christian worship, they were a mystery religion. You had to have catechism before you could be baptized, and only then could you have communion, and this enabled you to participate in the saving death and resurrection of Jesus. You might as well be talking about Mithras or something there. Same kind of thing. So that was important. Second, the cults of the dying and rising gods, which fit very well into the mystery religion, but was technically sort of a different mytheme that originally had to do with agriculture and the renewal of nature. And before that, the Israelite sacred king who ritually went through a death and resurrection to restore the fertility of the land and his mandate of heaven to rule, et cetera, et cetera. And then Gnosticism was kind of a variation on that, where you had to have a saving knowledge, which is certainly why even today, though Christians say that, oh, they hate Gnosticism, that was a heresy, it's obvious to any outsider that their belief that you have to believe a certain dogma. What is that? You have to have the saving knowledge. And I guess I would say also you could add a fourth thing, the hero cult, because the way Jesus is depicted in the Gospels, he's like Hercules or Apollonius of Tyana. He does wonders, and it's even the same mythic hero archetype, one type scene after another that you also find with the Buddha and Oedipus and Hercules and so on. And this, I think, was the original point of the death and resurrection. It's amazing how little the Gospels have to say about the death of Jesus as an atonement. You have that in the epistles, but in the Gospels, it's mainly you can't keep a good man down. The crucifixion, the Judas's betrayal, it's all the darkness before the dawn. Whammo, he's back. You enemies thought you could stop him, but as Peter says in the book of Acts, but God overruled you. And that really has nothing to do with this atonement. That's plugged in from the mystery religions, it seems to me. So again, that's like a geyser full of gibberish probably, but that's how I view Christian origins, my working hypothesis.
Well, no, that was really good. You mentioned 3 layers. I kind of see, I guess, 4 layers of redaction, I would say, or 4 errors of redaction that in the formation. For me, the post destruction of the temple of the Bar Kokhba is an error where I think you see the pro-Roman influence, the give unto Caesar. And then I think a big one, and I kind of want to ask you questions a little bit later on this, but would be like Marcion and his influence, and then in the next layer would be the proto-Orthodox response, which then leads up to the final layer, which I see as Roman Catholicism. Before I ask you questions on that, because that's kind of like my view of how some of the formations there, which might be kind of wild, but I don't know. I kind of want to go back to the Simon Magus thing before kind of getting into some of that. The polemic work Talmud Yeshu speaks of Simon Magus as a double agent, and I've seen some work that questions whether Paul actually had a conversion or found a different way to influence the community. To be his views seem more akin to Philo, and the question like that I have, that I don't believe the statement that's attributed that he was a student of Gamaliel, because his views seem to more align with Philo than they would Gamaliel, from my understanding. So, and I guess that's a lot. I kind of went on a rabbit trail too there, but no. Simon Magus, Paul as, the name changer, who maybe was a double agent, still with a view to influence the people to be more pro-Roman. What do you take of that? And do you see him as a disciple of Gamaliel or not?
I think you're right about that's part of the Judaizing, Catholicizing emphasis of Luke, who I think was actually Polycarp of Smyrna. I think it's a 2nd century work. And the Theophilus to whom his works are addressed is the Bishop of Antioch, Theophilus, who was Polycarp's colleague. But I agree, like Chaim Maccabee points out in a couple of his books, like one of them is Paul and Hellenism. He says if Paul, well, he did take Paul to be the actual author of the epistles. I don't. I think it gets more complicated than that. But nonetheless, whoever wrote them seems to just have the vaguest acquaintance with Judaism. The way scripture is treated, as Maccabee points out, sounds more like the Nag Hammadi texts than rabbinic stuff. I remember years ago, I finally got around to reading W.D. Davies' book, Paul and Rabbinic Judaism. Oh man, or maybe just Paul. Oh, I can't remember now. But in it, this is supposed to be the big classic that shows just how Jewish Paul's thought was, again, based on the canonical epistles. I read it and I thought, what? Am I reading the same book? This does not seem to make its case at all. In fact, it's almost a refutation of what people say about it, because the closest he comes to anything in the Pauline epistles is the idea of the good and evil inclinations. And that's kind of like where Paul says, I know that sin dwells within me and all this. There's another law in my members, but I don't think it's the same thing. It's not really the meat of the Pauline doctrine, that I know that in my flesh dwelleth no good thing. Who will release me from this bondage of death? That seems to me that, and when he in Romans 7, he's talking about the lot of the unregenerate. I mean, he seems to be more of a perfectionist, and this just doesn't sound rabbinic to me at all, and certainly not the. I mean, he quotes the Septuagint or translates it into Greek himself. The guys in Palestine had a funeral for the Torah when the Septuagint was published. It's like Mark 7 quoting Jesus debating with the scribes over Isaiah, and Jesus' point depends on quoting the Greek Septuagint because the Hebrew text doesn't say the same thing. And so you're supposed to accept Jesus having a debate with the rabbis from the Septuagint? No. I think it's all Hellenized, but Luke, Acts, Ephesians, 1st and 2nd Peter, and maybe a couple of other ones are Catholicizing documents, as F.C. Bauer pointed out, because it's ill concealed that they're trying to make Paul sound like Peter, and Jesus sound like Stephen, and Paul sound like Stephen, and Jesus and Peter have the same career, issuing in an arrest at the temple and trials before Herodian monarchs, and so on and so on. And they're even. Paul's mentioned by name, of course, in 2nd Peter, that, I know Paul, a lot of people are getting weird stuff out of reading Paul, but granted, it's difficult material, and the unstable nuts out there twist the text. But our brother Paul, he was, if you read him right, he's a good guy. And after all, it's nothing new for people to misinterpret scripture. Oh, wait a minute. You're thinking of Paul's epistles as scripture and you're the Apostle Peter? No. This is a later attempt to merge the two together. And you can read Ephesians and 1st Peter the same way, but especially Luke and Acts, where Paul does this charade to make it look like he, when he's paying for the haircuts for the guys who are finishing up their vow and all this stuff. And it's even put as if this, of course, is a scam, right, Paul? But maybe it'll it just seems to me that stuff is no evidence for what Paul was like. And one last thing, and I'll shut up about this, no conversion I think it is very important that Paul's conversion is told 3 times with somewhat different details in Acts, of course, and there's almost 2 more versions, because the whole thing seems to me to be derived from 2 well-known, already old sources. Euripides' play, The Bacchae, in which Pentheus, the king of Thebes, I guess it is trying to persecute the new religion of Dionysus, which has just infiltrated the city. And he has Dionysus jailed. He doesn't realize that Dionysus apostle is really Dionysus in disguise. And he has a miraculous prison escape, and he tells Pentheus, you think you have power over me? You don't. He tells him pretty much what Jesus tells Pilate, you'd have no power over me unless it was, you're just playing a role here. And then he miraculously sort of hypnotizes Pentheus, said, wouldn't you like to join the group? Yeah, I would. And he says, okay, you're going to have to dress up as a woman because my followers are all women. And if you want to go check them out, you want to be in disguise. Okay, he does. And he climbs a tree to observe them having their crazy rituals. And they recognize him and tear him to pieces, limb from limb. And Dionysus has already said to the audience, now we'll see if he can take it as well as dish it out. Well, this is just what happens to Paul. He's persecuting the Christians. And suddenly he has this, and well, actually the rest of the story, the miraculous escape and all that, that's in chapter 16. But he does become a Christian. He does get persecuted for it and finally dies. But there's even a scene where the risen Jesus appears to Ananias and makes the same kind of nasty remark. Now he'll see how much he has to suffer for my name. Yikes. Well, the other source is 2 Maccabees chapter 3, where Heliodorus, an official of the Seleucid emperor, is put in charge of a raid on the Jerusalem temple. We could use that money. Those Jews don't need it. Why don't you go down there and sack the place? Well, he does it, but he doesn't actually get there because in front of the temple, an angel appears on horseback and tramples him, and he's knocked out and blinded. And the Jewish elders say, oh boy, we're going to answer for this. Let's nurse this guy back to health. And so they do, and he regains his sight, and he pretty much converts to Judaism and goes back to the emperor and says, like, here's what happened. That's why I'm empty-handed. And he said, well, what would you suggest that I get another guy to do? He says, well, if you want him to get pummeled and to convert to Judaism, you could have him try it. Wait a second. And these were well-known works. It just seems to me, and you look at the epistles, there's not a word about this. It says at one point, when it pleased God to reveal his son to me or in me, which kind of fits the context better, then, okay, I began preaching, et cetera, but there's nothing about Damascus Road. There are various remarks about him persecuted the church, but every one of these seems textually dubious. J.C. O'Neill did a great little book on this, showing that some of the bits are using alien vocabulary to their context. They seem to be interpolations and so forth. So I wrote one of my chapters is the legend of Paul's conversion. And in fact, in Romans 16, he or somebody pretending to be Paul speaks of, I think it's Andronicus and Junius, notable among the apostles who were my kinsmen who were in Christ before me. What? This guy comes from a family of Christians? Hold on. What are we talking about here? And then you think of what the Ebionites said, that Paul was a Gentile who converted to Judaism because he had the hots for the high priest's daughter, but he just couldn't hack it. And so they kicked him out, and he said, they're going to be sorry they did this. I'm going to destroy Judaism and siphon off the converts. Was that true? Well, I don't know. But how come? I mean, it's hard otherwise to explain how he speaks of the law as a terrible burden. Jews don't think that. Jews never thought that. That's what Gentile would-be converts thought. Right? That's why in the epistles it says, hey, don't put a false stumbling block in the path of these dumb pagans. This stuff is all natural for you, circumcision, kosher, and all that. But you're asking them to change their whole lifestyle. What's important, that stuff or Christ? I mean, that sounds like either he knows very well where they're at or he's there. He says, when among Jews I behaved as a Jew. You mean it was just a strategy? What does he mean? He says, when with Gentiles I behaved as one of them. Well, that kind of throws them both on a par. Which was he? So I don't think it's at all clear who Paul was, but my guess is he was Simon Magus. And one last thing, the church fathers all said Simon Magus was the father of all heresies, especially Gnosticism. Well, what do you know? The Gnostics said that Paul was, they said Simon was the father of all the heresies, but the Gnostics said Paul was the father of all the heresies. Well, maybe that's because they're talking about the same guy. And as Bauer pointed out, even in Acts, it's pretty obvious that Simon is supposed to be Paul, crassly trying to buy apostleship, recognition from Peter, and with money and so on. So much of it is still vague, but a lot of it comes together. And I think it's like where you see the vultures circling, that's where you'll find the body.
Yeah. Well, I think the passage you mentioned, where I think it's a confession, it's the smoking gun, where he says, I become a Jew amongst Jews and a Gentile among Gentiles. I think that's the smoking gun of like, yeah, he becomes what he needs to people. So you mentioned First Peter, and it seems to have a pro-Pauline perspective. Yet, if you look at the secret epistle of James, or what's called the epistle of Peter to James, he's referred to as the enemy. So I have a hard time squaring First Peter with what I would say the historical Peter, who I'd see in the tradition of the Ebionites, James the Just, who would see him as a heretic, because the Ebionites rejected Paul and saw him as a heretic. I have a hard time squaring First Peter definitely with what I would see. Now, the pseudo-Clementine literature, I think, may reflect like an earlier, more authentic tradition. As a lot of texts, we don't have the original text, so, it seems like it has layers of Catholic redaction in there, maybe. What are your views, I guess, of the pseudo-Clementine literature, the authentic nature maybe of like the epistle of Peter to James, the Didache, I think may reflect an earlier tradition of the community, say of James, Peter, John, those who kind of remained within Judaism versus Paul, who went his own way.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. One giveaway for that is the way the Eucharist is handled. There is nothing about the death of Jesus or atonement. Rather, the bread drawn together from wheat from all over the hills and all that. It's like the unity of the community, but there's nothing about the saving death of Jesus, yet Jesus is mentioned. He's important. Well, thank you for your servant Jesus and your servant David and all that. So they do sound like sort of lightly Christianized Jews, the kind you would sort of expect from the book of Acts. I think most scholars that I know of think that the that there is a 2nd century section of the Pseudo-Clementines, which they call the Ebionite Acts. And that's where you have the debate between Peter and Simon Magus, where Simon sounds like Paul and like Marcion, especially. And I think that is more of the historical situation. And the 3rd Peter, as I like to call it, the Epistle of Peter to James, that is more of an Ebionite thing, and it could well be authentic. It shares the notion of James as the head of as the master of the missionaries with the Gospel of Thomas. We know that you will depart from us. To whom should we go? And he says, wherever you come from, apparently from missionary journeys, you will report to James the righteous, for whose sake heaven and earth were created. I think that's a character much like the elder in the so-called Johannine epistles. First Peter, I think, does not in any way represent the historical Peter. It's an attempt to counter that stuff. So no wonder it doesn't fit. And the same darn thing with 2nd Peter, which is a pseudonymous sequel to the pseudonymous 1st Peter. And I mean, it slaps you in the face with pro-Paulinism, because that's the one where, oh yeah, our brother Paul, writer of scripture, get out of here. And Bauer's paradigm just seems to me to be vindicated anew all the time.
Okay, yeah. So my next question is maybe in the realm of conspiracies. I don't know. Was Paul a real person? So there's some things. It seems like there's some similarities in the embellished story about Paul, where he was in the wilderness for 3 years. Josephus was in the wilderness for 3 years. Was Paul an literary invention of Marcion or somebody in the 2nd century? Because I see potential, at least story layers brought from different things that made up who Paul was. And the first copies of Paul's letter we have are found conveniently by Marcion. Did he find them or did he invent them?
Yeah.
And where do you see those embellished stories? He was a student of Gamaliel, the 3 years in the wilderness. I mean, where did all this come from?
Some of it, like the conversion comes, I think, from 2nd Maccabees and the Bacchae. It's been suggested that at least part of the travel narrative of Paul comes from traditions of Apollonius of Tyana, who goes to the same string of cities in the same order. Now, that doesn't prove anything, but it's kind of striking. It's possible Paul is another version of a sort of a nickname for Apollonius, but I've never been able to nail that down. I've read it suggested a couple times, and I asked the gang at the Jesus seminar, does anybody know if Paul is a short version? Nobody really, they all confessed ignorance. So I don't know if it's even possible to find out, but that could be. I think there's stuff that comes from the Gospels, possibly. I mean, the passion narrative of Paul so closely parallels that of Jesus, especially in Luke's Gospel, that you wonder. I mean, on that basis, some people have argued that Paul and Jesus were two names for the same guy. I believe Lena Einhorn, right? I think it's Lena Einhorn argues that in a couple of books. Well, I wouldn't go that far, but it is striking that there's so many similarities there. With Josephus, another gutsy writer, Ralph Ellis, a lot of people dismiss this guy as a nut. I don't share that view, even when I don't agree with him. I'm grateful for his pushing the envelope. And it's like Poe says in The Raven, he dreamt dreams no mortal ever dreamt before. And he's fascinating in his historical reconstructions. Again, I don't buy them all. But for instance, he says that Paul and Josephus were the same guy, and he points to a number of parallels. And I said, well, I find that a little hard to accept, but you're on to something. It seems to me that that Acts, which it seems pretty obvious, used Josephus, and Luke used Josephus. Well, maybe he filled in part of the life of Paul from Josephus, and that's why they're so similar. But my guess is the historical Paul was Simon Magus, because Josephus tells us that in the circle of Agrippa, I guess it was Herod Agrippa II, Felix, Festus, Drusilla, Bernice, and all these people, they had a kind of a Rasputin figure, a sort of sage, wizard, astrologer guy that hung around with them, and he was named Simon. And Paul is associated with these people too, and he was supposed to be a miracle worker and so forth. And once you accept that, you begin to wonder, well, Simon supposedly went to Egypt to learn magic or whatever. Paul supposedly did miracles. And Ben Stada, mentioned by the rabbis, went to Egypt, and so forth. Oh man, or the Egyptian, he may have been him, and he also went to. So it seems to me that there is a pretty good case. I mean, it's circumstantial evidence, but that's all you got. So it has to condition your dogmatism on it. But it seems to me, I could, like in the book, I go into other weird stuff that kind of fits, like even from the Toledo of Yeshu, but it makes the most sense to me of other stuff that really doesn't make any particular sense if you isolate it and make it just an anomaly or an aberration. So that I find that pretty compelling, but who knows?
Okay, so talking about Christian origins, I mean, so the chicken or the egg, which came first, the gospel or the epistles? And kind of back to a statement I said earlier, I think that the early stage of like the layers of redaction would have been the pro-Roman era, post-destruction of the temple, before Bar Kokhba, kind of the Flavian era. And that's kind of where we have the pro-Roman redaction. And
yes,
that's
I
where
forgot
I see
that.
Paul.
You're right.
That's where I see Paul.
Yeah,
I
I
see
think
Paul
that's
coming
correct.
in there, and that's where the question I guess I'm getting to is that his I don't believe his conversion. I feel like his message was Hellenistic, to pull away the Jewish zealots into a pacifistic religion. And I'll couch it with this: the people with the money and the wealth to produce and distribute would have the power to edit, and I would say that would be the elite class in Rome. What do you see in like the distribution of Paul's letters? And a final thing, because I know it's a lot, the Clementine homilies to me kind of give proof that there was a conflict between two communities. So I wouldn't completely say Paul was totally fabricated. Somebody, Simon Magus or Paul, existed and there was a conflict. So I wouldn't say he was completely made up, but Marcion, I think, may have influenced his letters a lot. What do you make of, I guess, the that first phase of Christian formations and Paul's influence on that?
Well, I do think the earliest Christianity was some kind of Qumran type Jewish apocalypticism, perhaps very likely stemming from the Essenes. I read an interesting thing about the origins of the Lord's Supper, how it seems to fit better with the every 50-day celebration of Pentecost as the giving of the law at Qumran, it fits that better than the Passover. It's been changed, and it looks like, yeah, Renan was right. It started as an Essenism. But by the time you get to Paul, it does seem to be Roman accommodationist. And the thing with the Gospels and the epistles, I don't know if we can ever say which was first. They could be contemporary, because I think Schmidholz may have suggested this, that the non-historical Jesus tendency of the epistles may have come at any point from a community that never believed in a historical Jesus. So they quoted no sayings, they didn't know them, and they weren't coined yet, maybe, and there weren't any stories until Marcion and others began rewriting the Old Testament to make it into gospel stories. And they rejected the Old Testament ostensibly, but they kind of liked a lot of it and rewrote it as Jesus material. Paul the Pauline tradition seems to represent a tradition where they didn't understand there had been a historical Jesus, but the Marcionites or others, yeah, it must have been some kind of Marcionites, in order to salvage what they could of the Old Testament, was to Christianize it. The Catholic Christians Christianized it simply by reinterpreting it. Oh, this is a hidden prediction of Jesus and all that. But I think Marcionites, I tend to think, I go along with, he wrote Marcion and the Dating of the Synoptic Gospels, Marcus Vincent, that's it. And he says that Marcion wrote the first gospel, and that he wrote it, and he has interesting arguments for this. He said that he wrote it as by rewriting the Old Testament stories, and he made copies of it for his students, that it was very much like a modern graduate seminar. I mean, we know these guys had groups, circles of students like Aristotle and Plato did. And that he said, don't, not for circulation, let's study this. But the students loved this and said, well, I'm afraid I can't help sharing the good news. And said, you got to see this. And so it began to spread without Marcion's knowledge. And other people said, I like this, but I think it could be even better, which is how you get Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and eventually John. And that this finally comes to Marcion's attention. And if this seems historically implausible and conspiratorial, it's not much different than the scenario implied in 3rd John, right? Where suddenly it comes to the elder's attention that people representing him have been teaching Docetism in his name. And he says, wait a minute. We never sent these people out. If somebody tries this, slam the door. Well, it's that kind of thing that you could easily imagine it being done behind the big guy's back. And once he finds out about it, what does he do? And he said, well, the cat's out of the bag now. I'm going to have to publish this, but let me revise it. And apparently he said some of the stuff in these pirate editions was pretty good. Let's add it in. I can't explain them at the moment, but I found the arguments. It has to do with comparing the readings of different ancient copies and so on. But it's well worth reading. And it seems to me he's probably right, so that Marcion was the one that wrote the first gospel and the epistles, that he had a rendition of them. And Tertullian actually says, when Marcion discovered the epistle to the Galatians, he did this and that and the other thing. Well, now that could just mean when he got his first reading of it. I admit that, but I can't help, like you, thinking that it's like Joseph Smith discovering the Book of Mormon, or the priests in Josiah's time discovering the Book of Deuteronomy. Right. Yeah. Yeah. I found it under the old Sunday school ledgers. Yeah, I'll bet you did. And because it's part of the genre to say it's an old book, not just something I whipped up. And same as it's all pseudepigraphy. That's why anybody does it. So, but I don't think Marcion wrote all of them necessarily. Like Colossians strikes me as simplified Valentinianism, and there's nothing in there that doesn't sound Gnostic. That Christ has the fullness, the pleroma of God in him, and so oh, wait a minute, and so forth. First and Second Thessalonians appear to be much later works that are not particularly Gnostic, but have to do with their damage control jobs because of the delay of the parousia. Anybody could have written that. Obviously, the pastorals are part of the Catholicizing layer. So I don't know that he wrote all of them, but he could easily have written at least part of Galatians and Romans, because then you have to get into, are these even unitary texts? And I tend to go along with Van Manen and say, well, no, they're not. In fact, if you look at 1 Corinthians, without the harmonizing instinct, you begin to realize that each chapter refutes the one before it. Can you eat meat offered to idols or not? Can women speak in the assembly or not? Should you speak in tongues or not? Should apostles get reimbursed by their congregations? Yeah, but no. What is this? And we don't preach sophisticated wisdom, but among the mature we do. Like, it just sounds like somebody has heavily interpolated this to sanitize it, either in a Gnostic or an anti-Gnostic direction. So I'm with Van Manen. I think the epistles are patchwork quilts, and so you got the same problem with the historical Jesus. What was the historical Paul?
Yeah, definitely. So that work you referenced, what do you think? Luke came before Mark? Or, well, no, I take that back. Marcion's work came before Mark, Luke, and Matthew, or
I think that.
So Marcion, because Marcion's the first gospel we have a copy of, and then we have the other traditions, which I don't know. There may have been various oral traditions that fed the various different communities.
Right.
Each one definitely seems to be to a specific community. And the interesting thing that I became aware of is that the first community to widely distribute the Gospel of John was Marcion's community, which the views tend, they're more Gnostic and they deify Jesus a lot more than you're going to find in Mark, in the earlier Mark, where it doesn't have the virgin birth or the resurrection. So there's definitely, that's where I can't subscribe to like Atwill's theory that they were all four made up at one time. There's just too much divergence there.
Yeah, I can't accept that. And by one that Josephus wrote them all, I think that's what he says in Caesar's Messiah. That just makes no sense to me.
But I see influence of maybe Marcion rewriting Paul's life in the vein of Josephus, that maybe there's a connection there.
That could be.
So what?
Well, the problem there is that Acts generally is anti-Marcionite. It seems to me, it is heavily Catholicizing. Let's paper over the differences. Let's make Peter sound just like Paul and vice versa, and so on. So that's a problem. And when Paul wants to go to Pontus to preach the gospel, and the Holy Spirit says, hold on a minute there, Paul. I don't think we want to go there. Why? Because that's where Marcion was from. And when Paul in chapter 19, 18, 19 is given his farewell address to the Ephesian elders in Miletus, he says, now I know that among you and in this area, all kinds of heretical wolves are going to come around, siphoning off sheep from the flock, teaching weird things. Who's he talking about? Oh, probably the Encratites, the Marcionites, the Gnostics, and all those guys who were at home there. They all appealed to Paul. We know from other writings, and Luke, whoever, Polycarp, knows that, and he's got Paul saying, look, don't blame me. When this happens, remember, I told you. And it seems to me that it's anti-Marcionite. Joe, something about Luke Acts is anti-Marcionite. I just can't remember his name. Oh, that's real. That's a lot of help.
Luke Acts, Acts definitely seems to be proto-Orthodox or Catholic rewriting, trying to make Paul, let's preface this. I think Paul was going into disfavor when Marcion found it and brought him into favor. And then Luke Acts, my idea is that Luke Acts was written by a proto-Orthodox who had seen Marcion as a heretic, because they rejected him as a heretic. And so then they tried to take Luke there and, I guess, as you said, Catholicize or, redact it and add on Acts as a way of rehabilitating Paul, and getting him where they could distribute him to the rest of the various communities because by the time we get to the 4th century and they try to make it a universal church, they've got to harmonize the message that they can get everybody to buy in when they were in total divergence. So I think that Marcion invented something, and then the proto-Orthodox redid it, and then Acts is their justification for taking Paul when the Ebionites rejected Paul. So they're like, how do we have a religion that's based on Paul when the earliest followers rejected Paul? And I think that Marcion was the catalyst in the proto-Orthodox, and then Catholic just took it further. What do you think of that theory, I guess?
Oh, yeah. And that's the origin of the New Testament canon, period. Marcion was the first to come up with the idea. Once he rejected the Old Testament as not as a bad book, but as not a Christian book. He believed that the creator God was the Old Testament deity. He gave the law to Moses. He wasn't a bad guy, but he was a pretty rough customer. The Jews were his chosen people, and he would send a Messiah to liberate them. Great, more power to you. But that's not Jesus. That's not Christianity. That's not the gospel. And it's all been screwed up because the 12 were such dimwits, as we see screamingly in Mark's gospel. Just a bunch of idiots that are only there to be corrected. And so under that influence, those who looked to the 12 as their figureheads said, Jesus was the Jewish Messiah. Yeah. And so we have to keep the Jewish scriptures. But this Marcion guy, it's not a bad idea to have a uniquely Christian scripture too, but his is a little dicey. How about if we come up with some other gospels to add and some other apostles? It was slim pickings, but these 3 letters, they're anonymous. Let's say they were John's. Here's one by somebody named James. Here's a couple that are supposed to be by Peter. Here's one that's by somebody named Jude. What the heck? Let's connect them up with these Bible characters. and they're not much, but they're not Paul. So we can have the whole group. And as for Paul, let's dull the edge there. Let's have 3 Pauline epistles that will create a conventional Paul, an ecclesiastical Paul. And but how are we going to square them? In fact, I suspect they were originally intended to replace the larger canon of Pauline epistles, but couldn't do that, so they interpolated those. Winsome Monroe's great book on that, Authority in Paul and Peter, goes into that in great detail. And she says there's a pastoral stratum through the rest of the epistles. And it's pretty easy to spot them once you know what you're looking for. And so with this, they, Polycarp, according to David Trowbridge's theory, created the 27-book New Testament, including Revelation, but it took quite a while for everybody to jump on the bandwagon, like with Athanasius's Easter encyclical. It said, okay, everybody, from now on, it's these 27 books. Get it? And of course, the point was that the people that delivered these would be back eventually to make sure you had destroyed copies of anything that wasn't on the list, which is why we have the Nag Hammadi texts, right? These guys said, we're not burning these, let's hide them. And but then even there, it was like till the 6th century before the Eastern churches would accept the book of Revelation and the Western churches would accept Hebrews. And finally, they compromised. Well, all right, if you'll accept ours, we'll accept yours. And even then, even today, like in the Armenian Orthodox Church and the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, they got several more New Testament books than anybody else. So it's never even been closed. People think, oh yeah, it's all sewed up.
Yeah. Okay. So like the canon is like one of the earliest full New Testaments we have was Codex Sinaiticus. And that has a lot of the New Testament. I believe it also has 1 Clement. I'm thinking they're the Shepherd of Hermas, and I think another one that was
Barnabas, at least, is in
Barnabas, yeah. And then there was one I saw on the canon list, and it was Paul and some philosopher, but it's not in the
Paul
canon.
and Seneca.
Seneca, that's what it was.
Those
Paul
letters.
and Seneca. There was those 4 texts in it. I have your the pre-Christian or pre-Nicene New Testament. You didn't have 1 Clement or Shepherd of Hermas or Barnabas in here, do you? Or
oh yeah, I have Barnabas and the Shepherd of Hermas.
I think you have Barnabas, yeah, but not 1 Clement.
No.
Why'd you leave that one out?
Well, partly because it's deadly boring, but it somehow seems to me to belong almost genre-wise to a later stage of things. It seems to me you're already in the early Catholicism, whereas you've got New Testament type stuff going on in the others. Like Barnabas, I have in there partly as part of the Pauline circle, even if it's a pseudepigraph, because of course I think most of the Pauline letters are. And I mean, if you really want to get down to it, it's conceivable that it was by Barnabas, though I don't think so. It also, the teaching of it is a little, I think it's sometimes misrepresented as being a bit more radical or nearly anti-Semitic than it is. And that's kind of interesting. A lot of the stuff criticizing the Old Testament is very much like what you have in Jeremiah, that they're false pericopes and belief in commandments that God never gave and so on. But plus it's like a la Crossan, in his terrific book, The Cross That Spoke, it looks like the kind of stuff Barnabas has, these testimonia, are raw materials for the Gospels in an early formative state. So it seems to me to actually fit into the body of it. And Shepherd of Hermas, well, Origen thought that ought to be in the New Testament, and it is sort of raw early apocalyptic stuff. And so if you got the book of Revelation in there, I figure, well, here's another one. And it also serves to indicate that it was a whole genre. And like, I'm thinking partly of something that Benjamin W. Bacon said once. He did this fascinating article arguing that the book of Revelation was written by one of these prophesying daughters of Philip. And it's kind of far out, but interesting. But the thing was, the reason I mention it is he said that he thinks that the revelation of John is pseudepigraphal, and if it's not, it's the only example of an apocalypse that has the author's real name on it. That's part of the genre to be pseudonymous. And I thought, boy, that is interesting. I mean, how early was this? And the Christology seems to be very early. It's sort of adoptionistic. Fascinating. I mean, to me, this is like Christianity still in the furnace being smelted and molded. So I stuck it in there.
Yeah. Okay. So you mentioned something. All right. So as it's being formed, I felt like Paul was falling into disfavor. Marcion, brought him back. The proto-orthodox are like, this is great. We actually can sell our snake oil with this. And that's a rough analogy, but and then once it starts to become recognized by Constantine, and Constantine, I've seen estimates that he appointed 1,000 to 1,800 bishops and gave them the power to declare heretics and excommunicate, and the policy of Rome to censor things they didn't agree with. So like now Paul was in disfavor, but then he becomes the message, and then the state power is able to declare heretics and censor and burn and destroy anything that is not, because the winners write history. My question is, I have a lot of questions about whether Constantine converted, and if that's later apologists trying to say he did, when really his vision of the Cairo more had to do with Sol Invictus, and he conquered in the name of henotheism, maybe a belief in one God or something, but I don't know if Constantine was truly converted. But Christianity became something he could unify the empire and kind of cajole the masses. I mean, what do you take of Constantine's conversion and influence?
That's my suspicion also, because there are 4 different ancient accounts, I think more or less contemporary, of the Milvian Bridge vision and all that stuff. In 2 of them, it's the Cairo emblem he sees, and or some emblem, and in 2 of them he's converted to Christian faith because of it. And it's a little odd to leave. This is one of those things where the less spectacular version almost has to be the original, and because afterward he didn't shrink from functioning as the Pontifex Maximus of Sol Invictus. I mean, can you imagine Paul going along with that? He continued that along with being the head of the church, and he must have been some kind of had some sort of Christian allegiance, because we're told that he had people hunt for the relics of the 12 and put them all on platforms, and with the one at 12 o'clock being reserved for him, implying that maybe he was the vicar of Christ. I don't know, but he must have identified with Christianity. I mean, I gather he let it be known that he agreed with Athanasius, not Arius. So if they knew where the bread was buttered, they better vote that way. So he must have had a foot in it. But I suspect, and I've read this as a theory, that he was raised as a Christian of some kind. But who knows what that meant? I mean, we're told that, what's her name? The wife of one of the Roman emperors had a chapel where she had statues of Orpheus, Apollonius of Tyana, Jesus, and Moses. There's a kind of syncretism, and Constantine may have been born in that kind of environment. So I suspect he was not converted, just like I'm not so sure Paul was converted. That he came from, Romans 16 says he had family members who were Christians already.
I heard Bart Ehrman say on a podcast recently that his father was a henotheist. He believed in one God, and that he may have converted to being a henotheist.
Paul or Constantine?
Constantine. Constantine.
Yeah.
Are you familiar? Okay, so there's the Roman Imperial Codex, the Codex let me see if I say this right. Theodosianus, which was like a compilation of the Roman imperial policies in support of Roman Catholicism. Are you familiar with that?
Not very.
Not at all. Okay.
I've heard of it, really, and that's about it.
Yeah. I was just curious if you had heard of that, but their policies in support of Christianity and stamping out anything that wasn't. So I kind of want to circle back on kind of a final question trail. And you mentioned the Ebionites. James Tabor made a comment, or James Tabor, that the Ebionites are like the most authentic witness to who the historical Jesus may have been. How do you feel about that?
That's entirely plausible, but it's one of a number of equally plausible ones. Like, I think I'm not sure what he thinks of this, but I am very impressed by the idea that Jesus was some kind of zealot revolutionary, that I think the first modern era person that argued this was Samuel Hermann Reimarus, an 18th century deist. And he made a pretty good case for it. And then Robert Eisler did this huge book on it, employing the Slavonic Josephus and what it says about Jesus. And then S.G.F. Brandon wrote a book called The Fall of Jerusalem and the Christian Church, or something like that. And then another one called Jesus and the Zealots. And I find the arguments there very striking. I kind of say these days that I'm torn between Christ mythicism and the Zealot hypothesis. I leave out this guy Aslan wrote something about
Reza Aslan, Jesus the Zealot.
It's just a ripoff of Brandon without acknowledgement. And where it's original, it's stupid. But these guys who knew what they were talking about, they made an interesting case that a lot of odd things, again, that it's like there's smoke, but people are busy denying that there's fire. Like the cleansing of the temple, the way it's depicted in Mark, it couldn't have happened. The court of the Gentiles, where it's placed, is the size of several football fields. If that's where this really happened, then you must assume that Jesus had a large group of armed men, and that he was probably trying to loot the treasury for weapons. because it says he wouldn't let anybody bring the vessels back through the temple. Yeah, what was he doing? Just saying, hey, you keep that stuff out of here. He must have had an armed force. Later on, when Barabbas is introduced, it said that he committed murder during the insurrection. What insurrection? The one at the temple, maybe? And the fact that Jesus at the Last Supper tells them, look, if you don't have a sword, sell your shirt and buy one because you're going to need it. And then just after that, they go to the Garden of Gethsemane, where a sword fight breaks out abortively. The disciples are ready to defend him with swords. And Jesus manages to stop it. He says, no, put your sword away. I'll come peacefully. And then the fact that his disciples, Judas the Iscariot, that could mean about 3 different things, but it could easily mean the Sicarius, the dagger man, Simon the Zealot. Well, that's attested as the name of a political group a little bit later, but you can't assume that's the first that it was invented on the spot. It may already have been used as a. And even Peter, Simon Bar Jonah. Well, Jonah is unusual as a patronymic in those days, but there was another assassin group called the Bar Jonim, which means the extremists or the outsiders. I think Oscar Coleman translates it the terrorists. And Peter, of course, is the guy with the sword that tries to cleave the skull of the. I admit, how does Jesus die? It's not a cup of hemlock. He's crucified as the man who would be king. Are we sure it was a frame up? So I have to again think there's smoke, but there's no fire. It does seem to me that's a pretty good case. But then so is mythicism. So I don't know. I don't know if this will ever be resolved. For me,
you don't know which one's more compelling. Well, the Ebionites were a branch of the Essenes, which were doesn't Josephus connect because he has his list of the 3 and then he adds a 4th.
The 4th philosophy.
Yeah, of Judaism, the Pharisees, Sadducees, the Essenes, and I believe the 4th one is the Zealots. But was the Zealots a branch of the Essenes? And is there?
Well, he mentions, I believe it's that during the Roman War, one of the leaders of the Zealots, or whatever they were called, was John the Essene. And in fact, from what we know of both groups, it's possible they were simply the same. There's a book by Cecil Roth, The Dead Sea Scrolls are in the title. I forget exactly what it was. Maybe it was Who Wrote. No, that was somebody else. But he says, from everything we're told about the Essenes and the Zealots, they sound so similar. They may have been the same. In fact, there's the War Scroll at Qumran, and it looks to me like if there is a shade of difference between the two, it's just that the Essenes were quietists waiting for God to light the fuse. And when the angels descended, then they were ready to go with the weapons and even ornamentation for the horses in battle. I mean, the thing gets down to so many details as to their military thing. Whereas the Zealots may have figured, no, as long as we're sitting on our butts, God's not going to do a thing. We have to spark the fuse. And I wouldn't be surprised if that was the only difference. And so in effect, they would have been the same. And that what you're saying, of course, I think I get your point that if the Ebionites were connected with them, then maybe that's compatible with the King Jesus approach. Does does Tabor, I've read that book, but it was a long time ago. Does he make Jesus a revolutionist?
Um, he focuses, I guess, more on the caliphate or the dynasty of Jesus, I guess, the family, the royal lineage. I don't, I I have the book. I'd have to look. I don't remember.
Yeah, me
I
too.
remember references to zealous, but I don't think I don't recall it going that deeply into that. So I'd have to look at it again. Um,
Well, you mentioned the fourth philosophy. I don't think Josephus calls it the Zealots, but it was started by Judas of Galilee, who was basically a zealot. And Richard Horsley has tried to deny that, saying that when they were putting their lives on the line, it just meant they were like Gandhi. They would die for their cause as martyrs. But I don't think so, because it's pretty clear from Josephus that Judas of Galilee was the patriarch of a line of revolutionary messiahs, Menachem and these other guys. So I think he's engaged in special pleading because of his own political inclinations. But it seems to me that they probably were called zealots, and if not, there was no real difference except nomenclature.
well, and I think that, but the zealots were connected to the battle in the Jewish-Roman war at Masada. They were the ones that, like that final salvo that they were fighting in the war there. So I mean, if anyway, the historical Jesus, the Ebionites, the Essenes were connected to the zealous, that may be where the traditions come from, and then they kind of fall out after the destruction of the temple, and there's a lot of different things that happen on the journey away from what may have happened. But with the censorship, we'll never know fully what actually happened, and that's where historical archaeologists try to put it all back together. So
well, this notion,
go ahead
with Joe Atwill and others. Anyway, the idea that the Romans cooked up pacifistic Christianity, that seems a little wacky to me, but it's only a notch over from something that is entirely plausible. Because, I mean, if they were a subversive group, could they have gotten away with saying, "Oh, we're just the Moose Lodge here. We pose no threat to Rome"? Could they have done that? Well, yeah, because that's essentially what the rabbis did. Right after the 70 AD thing, the Romans let them establish a new Sanhedrin that would be restricted to religious matters. They could have killed all these guys, but they decided, no, as long as you swear off troublemaking, go ahead. Well, that's really all Brandon's theory about Jesus as a revolutionary implies, that the Christians voluntarily said, well, Jesus, like even Judas of Galilee was a rabbi. He wasn't Che Guevara. And so if Jesus could have been a revolutionary would-be Messiah and had a lot to teach. So even, just like Judaism, well, let's forget that Messiah, that violent revolutionary stuff, and just stick with the Sermon on the Mount. And that makes perfect, plausible sense. So I think Joe has made it a little too hard to accept, but it's only a nuance of difference. So that even there, I think the revolutionary thing sounds pretty good.
Yeah. Well, and that was short-lived too, because then you have the Bar Kokhba revolt. So even though they sought to pacify them, and that's where I have my layers of redaction when I look at it. What the between 70 and 130, that was the pro-Roman influence, I would say. And then after the destruction of the temple, well, after the Bar Kokhba revolt, you have Marcion, and then you have the proto-Orthodox response, and then you have the Catholicization that happens. And that's kind of how I see the origins, I guess, there. But yeah, go ahead.
We're told that Bar Kokhba persecuted Jewish Christians that wouldn't go along with them. So that tells us that it was a recrudescence of violent messianism, but not from the Christians. And there have been plenty of messianic uprisings. The other thing, are you familiar with Hermann Dettering's article about how the Olivet Discourse in Matthew's version fits the time of Bar Kokhba rather than the 70 AD ruckus?
I am not, but that is interesting.
Oh boy. He says that Mark may have been readjusted to fit 70 in retrospect, but that this document, he or whoever pasted into the gospel, must still have been circulating in its original form, and Matthew had one too, and he decided to just stick with it basically and not make the changes Mark did. And he says all the stuff about the earthquakes, the famines, the pestilences, and all that. He says we have a pretty good idea what was going on in the first century and in the second, and the stuff in Josephus, etc., fits the second century more than the first. I published this in the Journal of Higher Criticism. I think I can dig it up online somewhere and send it to you if you like.
Yeah. Send me that for sure.
It's really fascinating. This guy, unfortunately gone now, Dettering, he was also a partisan of the Dutch radical critics like Van Manen. He taught me a lot. I think he was the most brilliant New Testament scholar of his time. He was incredible. And he was a pastor. He wasn't even a professor.
Oh, wow. All right. Well, this has been very informative, like always. Any final thoughts on the topics we covered today, and anything you kind of want to end it with today?
Well, it's just as always, for whoever sees this, please remind yourself that I am not trying to win converts to my theory. My goal is always Socratic, to raise questions for people to mull over and come up with their own answers, and to provide information they might not have run across so they can add that to their synthesis and make of it what they will. As that's what I've prospered from doing, and I want others to be stimulated the same way.
Okay, that's great. Is there any projects you're working on, and where can people find you online if they're looking for you these days?
I have a website, robertmprice.mindvendor.com, and it's got like an archive of articles, sermons, short stories, movie and book reviews, and all kinds of stuff. I have a couple of newish books, Judaizing Jesus, where I take on the almost universal assumption that you have to assume Jesus was a kind of an orthodox Second Temple Jew. I said, wait just a minute, that you're doing, that's an ecumenical bargaining chip, not a historical estimate in my view. Then another one called When Gospels Collide, where I show that, yeah, there are plenty of disagreements between the Gospels, maybe more than you ever noticed, but why are they there? Were the Gospel writers just a bunch of stupid idiots that couldn't get the story straight? It's just a bunch of dumb mistakes? No. You can show why they changed things to make a new distinctive point, so you're cheating yourself if you try to harmonize them into one thing. So it's a weird kind of apologetic, oddly enough. Anyway, I have a book coming out from Pitchstone Publications, I think it is, probably, well, I'm pretty sure in 2024, called Houses of the Holy, a higher critical survey of the world religions, where I do a kind of historical, critical, and theological survey of 12 religions, the usual big five, and a bunch of other ones like Mandeans, Yazidis, and Zoroastrians, and so on. That's going to be over 600 pages, so it's reasonably comprehensive. Then there's one that Prometheus is considering now called The Heresy of Paraphrase, subtitled An Interpretive Rendition of the Gospels, where I try to do a kind of modern targum of the Gospels, building a possible interpretation into a loose translation. And there's some funny stuff and some thought-provoking stuff in it. And what the heck was the other thing that's been accepted? I can't quite think of it offhand. But anyway, I got all kinds of irons in the fire.
All right. Well, definitely some interesting stuff to look out for. And I definitely want to thank you for taking time. Very thought-provoking. And yeah, same vein, I want to provide information for people to question and seek truth in, find information. So by pulling the threads, the idea we're pulling the threads to provoke thought and more of an open-minded journey for people. So I thank you for this, and look forward to conversations in the future.
You bet. Great. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, have a great day.